Menil Collection in Houston, and we're here speaking with Senior Curator Michelle White about the exhibition Chryssa in New York. Hi Michelle, thanks so much for talking with us today.
Thanks for having me.
This is such a great show. We were able to see it at DIA in New York City and speak with your co-curator Megan Holly Whitco. But can you start a little bit by explaining kind of the basis of the exhibition and what's maybe a little bit different here in the Menil than what was at DIA?
Yeah, so I'm excited you were able to go to New York because it's the same show, but it's very different here. The goals of the exhibition were to bring to light the work of Chryssa. She's an artist that so few people know, including art historians and academics and other curators. So this is an artist that we were thrilled to be able to draw attention to and dig into learning more about her work and her life, which just hasn't been done that much. And we're hoping this show can ignite new scholarship, new questions, and interest. The exhibition in New York was quite important because the show is about New York City. It's about the Greek artist's encounter of Times Square, encounter of this urban environment that she very much wanted to incorporate into her work and create work that reflected this time, that place. In New York, as you saw, the focus of this exhibition, which is the gates to Times Square, a piece the artist considered her piece de resistance, began the presentation in New York, and quite appropriately. The space in New York is also pretty special. It's in a space in Chelsea, so there's more of, the architecture reflects more of the history of that neighborhood. There's brick walls, there's larger spaces, and the neon and the metal fit so well in that space because it had that urban patina. Here in Houston, we have a more traditional space in our Renzo Piano building, but we also had more flexibility with how we were presenting the narrative around this time. And what was really important to me is to take specific groups of works and arrange them so we could see how Chryssa was working on all of these parts of her practice at the same time. So the show focuses on the late 1950s through about 1970, and throughout this time, she's working with neon, she's working with the newspaper prints, she's working with natural light and artificial light all at once. And I wanted this iteration of the show to reflect how she was moving back and forth between a myriad of approaches to art making.
In the exhibition catalog, you talk about how Chryssa's use of symbols and alphabets were basically where she would turn letters into ideas. Can you explain a little bit like what the idea behind that is and how it kind of functions in her artwork?
Sure. And letters into ideas is so important to this work, and thinking about where Chryssa fits in art history. And when she first started working with letters in the late 1950s, of course, this is not long after artists. For example, Jasper Johns, beginning in the mid-1950s, also started using letters, often using grisaille palettes, just like the works we're in front of in this room. And her works were immediately compared to that, like how these artists were beginning to use the stuff of everyday life. And that also meant language, text, systems of communication. And for Chryssa, what's so fascinating is how ahead of her time she was, and how she was not just thinking about using the everyday like a letter, but using that everyday as a point of departure for her approach to abstraction. And this is really different than how we might think about pop artists or the kind of neo-Dada gestures of Jasper Johns. She's using it as a tool of abstraction. She was thinking quite a bit about the legacy of abstract expressionist artists like Jackson Pollock, and very much believed in the possibilities of abstraction as a tool to see the world with heightened reality, right? A very modernist perspective. So starting from a letter and moving into an abstract realm is exceptionally radical for this time.
Yeah, actually, it's a great lead into my next question. So it's like this interest that she really engages with typography, but like in the Cycladic book series, it seems she turns and departs more into more abstraction a little bit than in some of the other works. Can you kind of talk about that transformation of where she moves from these recognizable letter forms into more abstract types of forms?
It's a great question because actually we could start thinking about the Cycladic books as the beginning of her practice as an artist within this vein. And we wanted to, in this exhibition, start with the Cycladic books for that reason. She started making them in 1955, prior to her arrival in the United States, and really did think about them as the opposite of the letter forms, right? It's a surface with no letters. They're books without words, they're blank pages, but she certainly was not thinking about communication, because she was thinking about how the possibility of natural light hitting the page, spilling across the surface would operate like writing, that the light would inscribe these blank pages. And once you start looking at her works with letters and thinking about them through the lens of abstraction, you suddenly see how abstract her works are and how she can take these forms of a letter and turn them into something even like a giant letter T or a giant letter F, and almost turn them into something that looks quite unrecognizable.
Yeah, and I think a big part that you just touched on, this idea of light, is so central to her work. And I think a lot of times we think about the literal use of light with the neon works. But you also talked about in your essay, which was really interesting, was this how the non-electrified sculptural works are activated by natural light. And you mentioned that a little bit with the books, but can you talk about that a little bit more in relation to some of her other artworks?
Sure, and it's a great point because her work, especially through time, has been so dominated by her pioneering use of neon, which is so important and so groundbreaking. But as she's moving into neon, she's also thinking through natural illumination and the possibilities of natural light working as a tool of abstraction, right? Like, it becomes another device to take these everyday forms and contort them and shift them and turn them into something that looks less familiar than we might expect. And in the late 50s, she started working on a series she called the Projections. And you can see in this group of work, she takes these peg-like forms and distributes them across the surface. And each peg kind of works like its own little sundial. So depending on the lighting conditions, they have this remarkable ability to move and change. And for the artist, she was thinking through this idea of how to make work with light and how to activate a static surface through the conditions of the atmosphere and the gallery that a work would have been installed.
We were just talking about like the sculptural nature of a lot of her works, but she was also working with prints and kind of like the two-dimensional work that we have behind us. How did printmaking play a role in her work?
Printmaking was quite important for the artist, and by printmaking, I'll say printmaking techniques, because the work, like the work behind us here, newspaper from the Menil Collection, is something of a monoprint. So she started using the cast-off plates from newspaper printing. And as we know, she was enraptured by the energy and cacophony of Times Square. The gates to Times Square, of course, is this ultimate homage to the intersection. But of course, in that intersection is also the newspaper. The New York Times was then located in the center of Times Square. So the idea of the newspaper, the idea of communications and systems of communications pertinent to this moment and this place, the newspaper is everything. And of course, these kind of like discarded fragments from the process of printing was important to how she then started making work. And with these paintings called the newspaper series, she would take the discarded plates and use them like stamps, pressing them across the surface. And like our earlier discussion about this idea of abstraction, right? She's using this surface that's intended to provide clarity and meaning and kind of succinct information, and taking that, but then applying it in a way that they're incredibly hard to read. And they very much sort of teeter between this kind of pop art aesthetic and beautiful atmospheric abstraction.
I often think about when I see some of these works, it reminds me a lot of Agnes Martin's work, of the lines that kind of get created in it, but she's using those texts as creating the lines rather than an abstracting text to create that kind of form.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Agnes Martin, because Agnes Martin has an important role here with these works. In the late 1950s, Chryssa was spending a significant amount of time with her peers in Coenties Slip, the lower part of Manhattan. Artists including Ellsworth Kelly, Robert Indiana, Lenore Tawney, other artists kind of thinking through what the future of abstraction was. This is also the time when Agnes Martin starts thinking through what will become her gridded compositions. At the time, we know that Chryssa had a relationship with Agnes Martin that lasted a few years. So the influence of Agnes Martin on the newspaper works is quite significant and is certainly worthy of greater scholarly inquiry.
So as a curator, what drew your interest to studying Chryssa and kind of exploring her work more?
So my interest in Chryssa really started with my interest in Coenties Slip, as I mentioned. About 6 years ago, I did an exhibition on that circle of artists, bringing together Chryssa with Agnes Martin, Ellsworth Kelly, to really look at the formal relationship between the artist and their kind of shared interest in forging a new path for abstraction in the late 1950s. But it was also a time that I was thinking quite a bit about Chryssa in the Menil's collection. The de Menil started collecting Chryssa's work in the early 1960s, and we have what's considered one of the best collections of her early work in the world. So of course, as a curator of this collection, Chryssa has always been there. She's always been someone I've been intrigued with, and also an artist that, you know, like you've been saying, like she was ahead of her time. She has these like incredible connections to Agnes Martin, to Andy Warhol, to Jasper Johns, but doesn't quite fit. So it was always a sort of something I would think about, is how to bring Chryssa into our permanent collection galleries. How does she talk to artists like Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns? Can she hang next to Andy Warhol? And out of these sets of questions, it really led me down the path to trying to learn more about her work and recognizing how significant it was that she has not had a major exhibition since the early 1980s.
I always find that really interesting, of like how she's kind of like lost somewhere in those decades. So this is great.
She was lost, and I mean, there's so many factors in considering and questioning why that is. But the point of this show is that it's her time, and we're thrilled to work with Dia Art Foundation. Through Jessica Morgan, the director, had really pushed initially the conservation of gates to Times Square, which was an incredible feat of restoration work to get this sculpture on view, to make it viewable to the public for the first time in so long. And that was another reason why we wanted to do this show and bring it here, is to highlight the incredible work that Dia had facilitated.
Great. Thanks so much for talking with us. Is there anything else that we missed that you'd like to add or want people to know about the show?
I hope audiences come because they don't recognize her name, and recognize that her story, like so many stories of women artists in the 20th century, can so easily be lost. And we're thrilled to be able to share this work to our public.
All right, great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Find all of our videos and sign up for our newsletter at artthisweek.com. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter.